These are strange times. Nothing quite makes sense. We are in a recession, jobs are being lost, and there is a housing boom. But then again, there is almost always a housing boom in this country, which is great for those of us who can afford to be part of it.
It doesn't matter what's been promised by Mr Dern an election ago. 16,000 Kiwi-built homes should have been built by now, and we've got 500. Massive cost involved in that. But what I would say is RMA reform is the number one issue.
Are you really saying RMA is the number one solution?
Oh,
the number one issue?
It is. And tell you what, John, we need more housing, we need it faster, we need it cheaper, and one of the ways to do it is actually the RMA. I know you don't like it, but I tell you what, it's the number one thing that holds back developers.
And the foreign buyer ban made a difference. Closing tax loopholes made a difference.
Have gone up 27%.
Progressive home ownership.
What's wrong with paying a tax on the capital gain on your second property?
Well, it's not as though there's empty houses all over the place everywhere.
It's pretty clear listening to these two debate that neither of them have any solution to our housing crisis. House prices and rents have been rising faster than incomes for the last 30 years. It's incredible. That's why we now have the most unaffordable housing in the Western world. Folks, this is a disaster. It is not a race that we want to be winning, and yet house prices and rents are still rising. This has to stop. We have to hold house prices and rents stable for another 30 years to restore affordability, and it's very clear that these two leaders don't have a plan to deliver on that. We need action across 6 areas to hold house prices stable for the next 30 years. But at the moment, the big two parties are only agreeing on one of those. That's RMA reform. It's pretty clear that we need to reform the RMA. Most parties are on board with that. We particularly need to allow cities to build up medium density housing around our public and active transport networks. But the other 5 points are clearly still not part of their plan. The second part of it is local authority funding. In order to build up around our public and active transport networks, we need to give local authorities the incentive to allow development and the money to build the infrastructure that's needed for that development to take place. That's why TOP is proposing to give back the GST on development to local authorities. It's roughly a 20% increase in their budget so that they can invest in the infrastructure needed. We also need to break the cartel over building supplies. That needs competition policy reform and reform around our Building Act to allow new materials to come in from overseas so that we can build better homes more cheaply. We also need to unleash the power of our community housing sector. Both National and Labour are focused solely on getting Housing New Zealand going, but by bringing in the community housing sector, the likes of iwi and cooperatives, we can bring in charity money and philanthropy money and really get our community housing sector cranking, because after all, local communities know what's best for their people, and by supporting them we can have an increase in supply, particularly around affordable rentals. We also need reform on the tax system. We have some of the highest tax rates on other forms of investment in the Western world, some of the lowest tax rates on property in the Western world. Neither of these leaders are talking about solving that problem. In fact, Labour's tax policy would make it worse by increasing income tax. Last time that happened, house prices rose by 17% as investors looked for that tax-free capital gain. And lastly, the other big problem at the moment is monetary policy, this policy of quantitative easing, which neither of these leaders again talked about last night. It is a major threat to our current system, because it's going to cause another housing bubble. The Reserve Bank printing money, using that to buy debt off the banks. Banks are going to be lending that to people at super low interest rates, and we're just going to see another boom in our housing market right at the moment when we don't need it. We have reached the limit of the current paradigm of monetary policy, and it's time for something different.